how to choose an advisor, as well as how to choose a school. Our panelists are Nishita, Deka, Samantha McBirney, and Orad Reshef. So technically, Dr. Deka, Dr. McBirney, and Dr. Reshef. So they will give, just like with the last panel, a brief introduction to their current position, what their degrees are in, and then take questions from the audience. If there aren't enough questions, I will ask questions, but that didn't seem to be a problem with the last panel. So I will hand it over to Nishita.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so just a quick, brief intro of my background. So does this include like where I did my undergrad or anything like that?
Where you did your undergrad, where you got your PhD, what your degrees are in, and what you currently do now.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm originally from San Diego. I did my undergrad at USC. That's where I met Andrea. Started doing research with her, I think it was like my sophomore year of college or so. And I did my undergrad degree in electrical engineering. A lot of the stuff that I did was more applied physics focused, and then I continued that on for my PhD. So I came to UC Berkeley for my PhD, got my degree in electrical engineering as well. Again, it was more applied physics, hardware focused. And now I'm currently running a startup, and we are developing neural interfaces. So a lot of the same type of stuff I've been working on, a lot of hardware. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm currently still in the Bay Area too.
Sam?
Great. Yeah, so I'm Sam. I'm originally from the Bay Area, went to Caltech, started undergrad at Caltech, transferred to Berkeley. I was a bioengineer for undergrad and then came to USC to do my grad work in biomedical engineering. Same thing, just different name. And did my PhD with Andrea, and then I graduated almost exactly 2 years ago. I defended, and then came out to, I was living in Santa Monica already, but now I work at the RAND Corporation. And for those people who don't know, Ben actually mentioned policy work earlier, and I was like, hey, policy. RAND is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that does objective research with the goal of influencing policy and decision making. So pretty different from what I've been doing before, but a shocking number of engineers at a place like Ranch. So yeah, that's what I'm up to now. So still living in Santa Monica, that's where RAND is headquartered. And why would you leave, really?
So I guess I'm next. My name is Orad Reshef. I'm a Canadian. I grew up in Montreal. I did my bachelor's degree in theoretical physics at McGill. And then I took a year off because I had no idea what I wanted to do, which I guess seems to be a little bit unique so far. But I'll love to talk about that if you guys are curious. And after doing a year there, I went to Harvard for my PhD in applied physics. There I work mostly in optics and photonics, which is not theoretical physics, you will note. And from there, I'm a postdoc at the University of Ottawa. I'm basically doing the same stuff I did in my PhD, so optics and photonics and the like. And I met Andrea through Twitter. We eventually met at conferences and stuff, but I first came to know her on Twitter, so that's also a fun fact. And why would I leave Canada? It's so good, just like California.
Well, let's not get started on Canada versus the States right now. Yeah, Canada is a good place to be.
Oh, I mean, only in terms of the climate, it's wonderful here. Only in terms of the climate.
So before we get started on all of the questions, although there are a lot of good ones, what things did you consider when choosing your PhD advisor? So I'll go with what two things did you consider? So we'll start with Sam.
Awesome. So yeah, Andrea was my advisor. I was ultimately deciding between staying in the Bay Area and staying at Berkeley or coming down to USC for grad school. And even though USC has a rotation program for the biomedical engineering department specifically, which means I was not admitted into Andrea's lab. Technically, I was admitted to USC and given the opportunity to rotate. I went to USC with the sole purpose of researching with Andrea. And for me, the big things were research, but in the sense of Andrea had a very interdisciplinary lab, and although she hadn't had a bioengineer or a biomedical engineer before, she was really interested in what someone with my background could bring to the table. And it was clear that she was capable of doing a lot of different things. So really, at the end of the story, she was very open to new research being done in her lab, which some advisors aren't as open, which is also totally fine. I think it's just important to know that ahead of time. So I knew I would be able to make the research work, and it was the social fit. So someone had told me, which was interesting because I was actually engaged at the time that I was applying to graduate school. So when someone said this to me, it really struck a chord. They said choosing a graduate advisor should be similar to choosing who you marry, which was a very weird way to put it.
No pressure, yeah.
No pressure. But, and the person didn't know I was engaged when they said this, like they were just kind of speaking off the cuff. But they were saying it's just really important. It's a relationship that hopefully sticks with you the rest of your life. You're probably going to be spending more time with your advisor and in this research lab than you even are with a significant other during grad school. So it has to be someone that not only you respect in an academic sense, but I think in a personal sense as well. You will probably end up emulating your advisor more than you realized at the end of grad school. So finding someone that you view as a role model, I thought was really important. And when I first met Andrea, I thought we hit it off, and then I met a bunch of her lab members, postdocs, undergrads, grad students, and the vibe just felt very right. And so for me, a lot of that gut instinct went a long way in choosing an advisor.
So, Nishita?
Okay, so is this things I considered when I chose the program, and then are we going to talk later about things I would have considered in hindsight?
So you can do either. It is up to you.
Okay, so I'll just quickly go over things I consider when I chose the program. So location was a big thing. And, I remember back then being embarrassed that location was such a big deal for me, but the reality is, I remember you were giving me a hard time because it was such a big deal for me. But the reality is you're living here for a long time, and I'm still here. My career is here right now. So I do think it's really important to consider that, especially if you're someone where you're living really matters to you and it affects your quality of life. I think it's something that's really important to consider. So location was a big thing. I was kind of like the inverse of Sam, where I was considering, should I stay in SoCal or should I go to the Bay Area? And so that was something important I considered. And then also I wanted to pick a school with multiple advisors and multiple research areas that I was interested in, because I wasn't super set on anything in particular. I did join a group. So here at Berkeley, in our department, we get accepted by an advisor. So I did get accepted by an advisor. I was joining a group, but there were multiple areas and groups that I felt like were of interest to me. So I wasn't necessarily stuck in the same situation. In hindsight, I didn't really take advantage of that. I ended up staying with the same group, and it was, it was an interesting experience. I didn't take advantage of all the different resources I necessarily had exploring different groups or going to different meetings. So in hindsight, I think that's something I would have done more of, explore different groups more thoroughly. And then I also would have considered advising style a lot more than I did at the time. My only experience with an advisor of any sort was Andrea, because I stayed with her during my entire undergrad career. So I didn't really have experience with anyone else. And I didn't really know what different advising styles were like. I didn't know what kind of advising style would work for me, what would help me learn and work most productively. And so I think it is kind of a tough thing to figure out when you're just starting grad school. But I think it's important to think about, even, after you choose your PhD program, being very cognizant of what is and isn't working for you during that first year, during that first 6 months, because you can change. You're never stuck. And so I think advising style is something super important that I didn't consider much when I joined, that I would probably consider more now in hindsight.
So as for my answer echoes Nishita's answer so much it scares me a little bit. So I didn't apply anywhere that I wouldn't be able to to drive home from. So I kind of took a compass and drew a circle and only applied to places that I could get home within 6 hours or so.
And by home, you mean like your parents?
Montreal. By home, I mean Montreal, which, thankfully is near a whole bunch of like really great schools. So it's not like I was compromising. I don't live out in the middle of nowhere. I'm an island. So actually Montreal is an island, but that's not the point. So, so that was the first condition, which I forgot that I had. I didn't apply anywhere in California. As amazing as it sounds, I did never even consider going to grad school there. So that was the first condition. The second thing was really that I wanted to go somewhere that had many advisors that did something I was interested in. So I ended up going to Harvard largely because it was, the first reason really was it was the best school I'd gotten into in terms of tiers, but also it felt very flexible because they had a lot of professors there that did stuff I was interested in, and they also admit you into the program and you can rotate and pick a professor. Instead of being admitted into a group right away, you're admitted into a program, and then you can shop a little bit. In hindsight, I don't regret any of the decisions I made because what I turned into, I think, is largely dictated by the mistakes I made and stuff. But I could have done a better job shopping. I think when you are admitted into a school where you're admitted into a program and can pick your advisor, you feel very guilty even doing internships, like semester-long rotations in other groups. But that is explicitly something that they advocate you should do. And now that I'm on the other side of this and I have PhD students coming in from former groups or leaving my group to go elsewhere, it totally makes sense. There's 100,000 reasons you would shop around different groups, from advising style to just interest in topic. Like you can realize that actually I didn't really like this topic so much. And at the time I felt too guilty to even shop. It did end up working out for me. I did end up having kind of a co-advisory thing but I'm a specifically entrepreneurial person who made that happen. I brought people in a room and said, this is kind of the deal I want. I don't know that that's right for everybody. So I really think if you don't end up in a school that has this flexibility of being admitted into a program as opposed to being admitted to a single group, then you really have to be sure that the group you're going into has kind of the advising style you like. It's almost exactly what Nishita said in hindsight.
Yeah, and just adding on to what he just said, I also ended up finding a co-advisor and ended up finding, this is what I'm interested in, this is what I want to work on, otherwise I'm going to switch groups type of deal. Otherwise, I would have been unhappy with what I was working on in that one specific group, in my primary group. So co-advisor situation, I think, is really helpful for people, and I found it worked really well for me. It seems like it worked well for him too.
Yeah, my issue for my whole issue was that there was one group where the advisor was extremely strict and the students didn't have any time to explore anything. It was just kind of God on a mountain telling the students what to do and telling them exactly how to do it, and there was no exploration. And then I had another advisor, which is almost like an absentee father, who kind of let you figure stuff out entirely on your own. And of course the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. Almost like everything else, the sweet spot is almost never at the extremes. And some group members really love one and some love the other, and I'm someone who liked a mix of both. So I willed the mix of both into being. I found two people that work on complementary projects that are very similar, at least in terms of skill set and in terms of topic, and I got what I needed from both of them. I was able to explore what I wanted, but when I had a very specific question about something that I needed to know the process for, I can go to the other one. When I had a very big picture, kind of flourishy question, I go back to the first one, and that worked perfect for me. But not everybody in either of those groups had the other half of those two people. So I was very lucky in a way.
So getting to questions, because a lot of questions are beginning to come in. So how can you discover what someone's advising style is, right? Because all three of you have said it's super important, and it's clearly not something that you can just look up on Google Scholar. There's no kind of, rate my professor equivalent. So how do you figure that out? So we'll start with Nishita.
Yeah, so I think probably the fastest way to do it if you're starting out is just to talk to current students. That's probably the quickest way to at least get a feel for what it's like. Not all of them are going to be honest with you necessarily, and maybe some of them like an advising style you don't like, so you're not going to even hear what wouldn't work for you. But trying to get a survey of the current students in the group and talking to them independently and putting time into those conversations early on, I think is probably like the most effective, quickest way to figure out advising style. So asking questions like, how often do you meet with your advisor? How often do you hear back from him? Does he respond to emails? I didn't know that my advisor wouldn't really respond to emails. Just like little things like that, you can get those answers. Like all of my lab mates had those answers. Had I known to ask them, they had those answers. So I think asking current students is probably super effective.
Sam?
Yeah, I would add in recent grads as well, because sometimes current students can be in this very precarious position where they might feel pressured to answer in a specific way and even straight up lie. And Nishita knows that there was this lab, this infamous lab that was right next door to Andrea's lab for the longest time. And the advisor was known for being just an absolute monster. There's no other way to put it. And the students in his lab, however, were essentially told, you're not going to graduate until you find a replacement for yourself, which meant that if you approached a current student in the lab and asked a question, you might not get a genuine answer, because essentially their job was to rope you into coming into the lab so that they could graduate. It's rare that that happens, but it does happen. So I would be willing to bet money that if you had asked a recent graduate from that lab, they would be very honest with you. And if you ask a current student, they might not be. So definitely, I would say current students are really important, because advisors can also change and evolve. But also speaking to recent grads would be a good thing to do if possible. If you can.
Yeah, I totally agree with Sam on that. I think what people are willing to say after they've gotten their dissertation signed is very different than before they've gotten their dissertation signed.
Which is also why I have these 3 PhDs, because they can be completely honest. They already have their degrees.
That's pretty funny. I don't really have much to add other than that. I guess the thing you guys didn't touch on is if you're in a program where you're admitted in the program beforehand and you haven't picked an advisor yet, you tend to hear rumblings about people that are monsters. Like that kind of stuff leaks out eventually. And you get a sense sort of based on like the mental health of their students, what kind of advisors they are. But yeah, asking, when I was talking about my situation with my advisor, and I remember asking grad students, and they didn't lie, and they didn't really hide the truth either. But also, I kind of was in denial about, like my advisor replied to emails, so definitely not as bad as Nishita's. My advisor replied to emails, but sometimes it was hard to access, right? And students sort of said this, and I was like, oh yeah, but it's probably just them. So if they're willing to say something, listen to it. That's it.
So Nishita mentioned co-advisors, as did Orad. So how did you navigate working with co-advisors? How did you initiate and navigate working with co-advisors?
Yeah, so for me, it was a pretty natural progression. So there were a couple other groups in overlapping research areas as the same as the project I was interested in. And my primary advisor actually was not and did not have expertise in the area that I was working on. So I was already kind of looking for people with certain experience, and there were a couple advisors that I had been talking to about working on other projects. They are also groups that I was considering switching to during my first year. So that's how those relationships started. And then one of them in particular, I ended up in a situation similar to what Orad was saying, where I actually kind of had the best of both worlds. So he was really available, like could answer really specific questions, always ready to meet, always super responsive. But I also liked the freedom that I got from my primary advisor, who was really, really hands-off, the one who didn't respond to emails. He let me do whatever I wanted to do, which was also kind of cool. So I ended up sort of mixing those two, and I met with my co-advisor when I needed help with a specific problem I was having, and I felt really stuck. But then because I was still in my primary advisor's group, I had a lot of freedom to do whatever I wanted to do. And so that's how I navigated those two relationships. But I met my co-advisor because I was kind of exploring during my first year what other groups I could potentially switch into. And instead of having to choose one or the other, I just made it a mix of both.
Yeah, my answer is very similar too, I guess. By the time I had joined by the time I was starting on something, and so the reason and for a bit of history, I guess, the postdoc that I was working for just upped and left one day. Got a faculty job and then just couldn't say no, and then from November to December was gone. It really was that quick. And they had just started training me in the clean room. So for those of you that don't know, the clean room is one of these, special rooms where all of the air is filtered. You wear these plastic outfits and no dust can be allowed in the room because you're working on micro and nanostructured stuff. And it's a skill to learn how to work in a clean room. It's you can't just follow a manual. There needs to be someone to teach you kind of like the intricacies of the steps. And I didn't have someone. The postdoc just upped and left. And then started a new faculty job, and so was just never available via email. Almost ghosted me back before we used the word ghost. Anyhow, so I've really felt like I was out on up a creek without a paddle. And that's when I remembered that this other PI who really was, the last thing to add is my group didn't really have any nanofab people. And the other PI was just like a nanofab PI. That's all they did. All they did was work in the clean room, like Andrea's group, just like fab. So it's kind of natural to knock on their door and say, hey, this other guy you published a paper with, he actually started a faculty job. I don't have anyone, and you're already on the papers. You have people in your group that know how to do this. Do you mind if I just start going to group meetings? And he was like, sure. I mean, it was completely, that's a very special circumstance, right? So a postdoc just leaving and creating this vacuum is a neat opening to find someone else to advise you. That's not, you don't get that for free if you're in a bad situation. In terms of managing expectations, I don't know. I didn't find it to be a problem at all. I think maybe the two people I was working with, their ego was fine with it. But I've heard of it being a little bit more challenging to kind of satisfy two sets of expectations. But I didn't have an issue with that personally, so I really can't speak to how to deal with that if it is an issue.
Yeah, so just adding actually to that is similarly for me, my primary advisor, my co-advisor, they both got along really well, and they were friends outside of, academia. So it helped that neither of them really cared, whose group I was in more or who, what research area I was focusing on. So maybe that was a factor that also made it easier, which is something to consider. I guess if you have two advisors who hate each other, that's probably an ideal.
Nishita, I had one very tenured faculty and one untenured faculty. Did you have something similar like that?
Both of mine were tenured, but okay. I would say the rest of it is super similar to yours. Like one was heavily nanofab, the other one not so much. It was very similar to everything else you said. But they were both heavily tenured.
Okay.
So another question, how and when do you choose a research topic? So I'm going to let Orad start with this one.
Choose a research topic? This is funny. So in my letter to apply for grad school, I wrote the things I wanted to work on. I said, I want to work on optical computers because you know about electronics, but if you have electrons, you use photons, you get photonics, and that goes at the speed of light, and that must be faster. And I don't know, I read a Wikipedia article or something, and I put that in my letter, and I got into my program, and I started working, and my advisor was like, yeah, we don't really do optical computers. I mean, nobody really does optical computers. Yeah, Andrea's laughing because people have been trying since, the early 80s to make an optical computer, and there are some very good fundamental reasons why it's hard. Anyhow, but I didn't know this.
I'm not laughing. I'm just entertained.
Yeah, because it shows the naivete of an undergrad applying to a grad program. The truth is, you have no idea what the grand scheme of research is out there. You just have no sense. And nobody is faulting you for having no sense. So maybe that's kind of my answer is I don't think you need to for a little while. I think you start off, you kind of just get your hands dirty in the lab, kind of making things or something, just following someone else, and then you have to make sure to read a lot, and eventually a topic will percolate. I think that's fair, right?
So every group works differently, which is why I wanted, and I know your advisor is particularly hands-off and lets topics percolate. So Nishita, for I have a feeling
I mean,
it's different approach.
Well, I mean, I think Orad and I have basically identical PhD lives. Very, very similar to me. I worked on a project my first year that was in my primary advisor's area, didn't like it. Tried a different project my second year, and it wasn't really until my third year, end of my third year, beginning of my fourth year, that I found a secondary project that was an offshoot of that primary project, and the bulk of which became my thesis that I figured out and came up with that project. It took me until my end of my third year to figure out what that was, and that was what I really enjoyed working on for the rest of my PhD. So yeah, it just took a lot of time, and yeah, I don't know what else to say. It just took a lot of time, and again, groups are structured very differently. And similar to Orad, my advisor was very hands-off, and so he was very much of the camp that you should figure out your project, figure out what works for you. Yeah.
By the way, a PhD is many years, so things taking time is like totally fine.
It's fine, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of students come in and they're like, I want to make sure my PhD is 3 years. And it's like, that's a little misguided. Part of the reason a PhD takes a long time is kind of like, the analogy is like, if you're bored, you become creative, right? So right now, because of the quarantine, we're trapped at home, but suddenly, people have gone back to like, I started knitting and people have gone back to start doing creative stuff. Don't laugh at my knitting, Andrea.
I'm expecting socks.
You think what socks?
I'm expecting socks.
You're expecting socks.
Yeah.
But you live in California. You guys don't need warm garbs. Anyway, all this
It's freezing out here right now, let me tell you.
Is it, yeah? So,
it's like 60 degrees and sunny, okay?
Oh, 60 I'm crying ice tears from up here. It literally, all the snow literally melted this week.
Below this camera right now.
Sam's been in SoCal for too long now.
Unbelievable, you guys. But to finish my thought was that, like, boredom makes creativity, and that is why a PhD takes many years. If the point is just to get a project to work from start to finish, you would either hire a technician who knows what they're doing, or you would do like a master's, which has like a nice beginning, middle, and end. You're doing a PhD specifically for this kind of unstructured, bored time where you don't know what's going on and things will take time, which is frustrating, but I think that's part of the experience.
So, Sam, your PhD?
I think that's a really good way to put it. Things take time. I think it also depends, like Orad said, what kind of PhD you want. If someone comes in and says, I want to graduate in 3 years, they're going to have a very different experience. They're probably going to be handed a project that they perhaps inherited from an old lab member who graduated and didn't finish. And they're like, well, if you want to get out in 3 years, here you go. Someone else didn't finish this. It's not quite the reason that I decided to get a PhD. I kind of wanted a little bit of that creativity, that boredom, that think of something new and novel and exciting and impactful. And I think if that's why you're getting a PhD, that's going to take more time. I started when I started, because I was the first biomed person in Andrea's group, we were like, what am I going to do? I don't know. Let's figure out like where bio and med and all these things intersect in the world of optics. And so that took a little bit of time. It took some trial and error. There were some projects that we started and then realized this is going to take way more than one PhD to do. Maybe we should do something else. There was one project in particular that I started, and we were going to make a device to basically use inside a catheter to detect for bacteria that cause blood-related catheter infections. And then when we were kind of building the foundation for that project, we realized that there was this huge glaring issue in just how people determine the concentration of bacteria. So we thought, okay, well, we're going to go a different route with this. And then it was probably around the same time that both you guys have mentioned, end of year 3 or so, that then Andrea and I kind of came together and were like, we're going a completely different direction now, and we're going to work on a malaria diagnostic because this is something that's really impactful. It's something that, could really make a positive difference in the world. And it's probably the Berkeley in me, which Nishita gets now too. It's like this constant desire, this urge to actually do something that will affect people outside the lab. which again, that's very different research than kind of purely academic research. I always wanted to do something that people at a cocktail party might care about, or people who are not scientists might care about. And so then it was around like the end of year 3 that we decided to start working on this malaria diagnostic, which was the bulk of my PhD and is ultimately what I defended. So it takes a while, but I really enjoyed the process of getting there. I wanted a PhD because I wanted that creativity. I wanted that freedom to think of something completely new and interesting. I wasn't doing it just to kind of go through the motions and be like, well, I want these letters after my name, so let's just get on with it. Not the degree to get if that's what you're looking for.
Right.
But B, you're definitely going to go about it a very different way, and you're probably going to feel more rushed and pressured. And maybe maybe I should have felt more rushed and pressured. I don't know. But I didn't really feel that. So, yeah, take your time, I think, is the end of it.
I have a similar story regarding the topic. By the end of my 3rd year, it became clear that an experiment I was working on was never going to work. It turns out that you need to take losses into account. So you lose light as it propagates. And it's not that we didn't estimate the right amount of losses. We just made, we made some sort of like fundamental calculation error. And then suddenly this thing is staring us in the face that like, I just spent 3 years. I just spent 3 years working on something that will never get published and it's not going away. I mean, it's just like a huge, disappointment. And you start blaming yourself and you blame your advisor for not knowing all the details. And it sucks. But what's funny is like, I've forgotten that this whole thing had happened by now.
That's interesting.
Because by that point, you've done enough reading and enough like strife and you've figured out a bunch of stuff. You're like, okay, well, maybe this other thing could be interesting. And then you go down another avenue and then it turns out that one's fruitful. And the failure is part of the process. And yeah, like it's funny. By now, while you were saying how do you pick a topic, I forgot that, so I wanted optical computing and then I wanted this other topic and then that totally failed. And then I got on this third topic, which is now like the bulk of my career stuff. So, none of these things are permanent. I remember speaking to someone who was on my PhD committee. She told me that she did a PhD in particle physics and now works in photonics and optics. She like switched fields completely, right? Completely, because the skills you develop are not knowledge in a specific field. It's like how to solve problems in a very general sense. So the topic is not as set in stone as, for instance, picking your advisor is, which is very much set in stone. Anyway.
So on a related note to that, so this is actually kind of a two-parter question. So first, just because I admire someone's research does not automatically mean that we'll work well together for 4 to 6 years. So how can I get a feel for that before making a commitment? And that's kind of related to, do you choose the person versus the research? And kind of a related question to that is, how do you make that big judgment call on actually changing advisors? And how is that viewed? Obviously, none of you changed advisors, at least to my knowledge. It sounds like both Nishita and Orad did the co-advisor as an alternative strategy to changing advisors. But I'm sure you have friends who've changed advisors. So let's have Orad go first this time.
So the first thing was just because I admire someone's research does not mean we work well together.
Right. So how do you balance, being in love with a research topic versus a person?
Right. So, being in love with the person is 500 times more important than being in love with the research topic. It's hard to explain. I just told the story of this professor who switched fields, right? So the topic isn't important in the grand scheme. Of course, the greater picture of what the topic is important, but the specifics of the topic aren't super important because anyway, what you're working on in 10 years isn't going to be new anymore. Which, of course, your career is hopefully going to last longer than 10 years. How do you know that you're going to get along with someone? It's really hard to tell because it is like a marriage in a sense. So I have a two-part answer then. So the first is, like we said before, speak to former grad students and see what they say. Look at their website and see how often they've published papers and where they get published. Look at where students go after they're done their PhD, things like that. And the second thing I would say is that it is not as taboo as it feels like at the moment to switch groups. It's really, really not. It is extremely common. It is like, maybe it depends on the department a little bit, but if you start working with an advisor and you suddenly realize that actually I'm not really into this or I'm not whatever, you should be able to switch because it's like, like Sam said, it's like being engaged to someone, right? It is someone that is going to write all of your letters for the rest of your life. You're still going to go to them for advice. You're still going to have them write letters. I said this already. You're still going to be texting them all the time. They're going to text you for favors. It's just a thing it's a relationship that's going to last forever. The topic you're going to work on is definitely not going to last forever. My PhD thesis work was recreated by somebody and a first year, and it took them 3 months after I left, a few years to do. It is extremely discouraging to see that, but it also means that what you work on is new when you're doing it, but then isn't new anymore. But the person is always going to be there. The person is always going to be there. So I'd even go so far as saying a good person in, not so well-known school is way more important than a bad person in a well-known school. This is a debate we hear all the time. But a good person is good, and everybody knows that they're good outside of the school, right? Anyway, I'm now rambling and taking up some space.
Sam?
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough the person over the research, 100%. Yeah. And it might sound judgmental, but I still think that you can get to know a person pretty well in the first 2 minutes you talk to them. And so I would say talk to them. People are honestly doing a lot more video calls these days, thanks to the current situation. So if you can get on a video call with them, do, but just even talking to them on the phone for a couple minutes can make a really big difference. Are they even receptive to talking to you on the phone? If not, that says something in and of itself. B, if, it's just honestly, it really is like going on a date. Do you feel that instant connection with the person? Because
that chemistry, that spark.
Right.
It's such a huge factor because you're going to be seeing, it depends on the advisor, but this is someone that you will be interacting with hopefully the rest of your life. You might be seeing them every single day for multiple hours a day. This is an important person, and it's important that you get along fundamentally. And also, so much of research is so interdisciplinary as it is that you can either have this co-advisor set up, which is great, and I know a lot of people who have done that and been really happy with it, because then they get the personality aspects that they like with the research that they like. Or you can also just realize, me with Andrea's lab, engineering is hugely interdisciplinary. So if I'm a biomedical engineer coming into a heavily electrical engineering, chemical engineering, photonics lab, there's a lot of natural overlap. So even though technically it's you're the first, it's not as big of a deal as it seems, and you can make the research work. Research isn't siloed. And so find the overlap, create the overlap if it's not there, and then go from there. But yeah, person over research, 100%. And so, touching on people who have switched advisors though, straight up switch, there were a few people at USC in my BME class who did that. One person did it in their second year. One person didn't do it until the end of their third, beginning of their fourth year. They were that desperate. And obviously it takes longer. But those people that I know who switched are so happy. Yeah. Because in the scheme of things too, what is an extra couple years? It sounds like a lot when you're...
That sounds so terrible when you say that. But no, sorry, go ahead.
But no, it sounds like a lot of time when you're in your mid to late 20s, older, younger, wherever you're at. 2 years sounds like I've wasted my life. What's the point now? I might as well just leave. But no one's going to care if you took an extra couple years to graduate. And if you were proactive enough to say, I was unhappy in this lab, and these were the reasons why, and this is why I switched, that also says a lot about the type of person you are, that you didn't just kind of endure the pain and the suffering because you thought you had to.
100%. 100% right, yeah.
Yeah, and so I would say no matter what stage you're at, if you really do feel compelled to switch labs, obviously don't make that decision flippantly, but don't be scared by it either, because A, people do it all the time, and B, it can actually say a lot about the type of person you are in a really good way, depending on how you do it. So, yep.
So everything you said is right, and I want to add that we're bringing this up because this means there shouldn't be that much pressure in picking your advisor in the first place.
Exactly.
That, a wrong decision in your advisor is correctable.
Can be undone.
It's okay. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, you should put a lot of energy into it, but don't panic.
Yeah, you don't need to feel like you're stuck in the situation that you put yourself in the first month of grad school. Just echoing what everyone else said, I think the biggest thing, like I think of people I know who switched and when they did it, and really the only thing that held them back was fear of switching. There wasn't really any concrete reason other than being afraid of leaving that advisor and switching to another group. And so, like a friend of mine, he ended up switching 3 times. He didn't switch. Gosh, he was with his first group for 2 years and then took time off and then went back to that same group, which he shouldn't have done. And then ended up switching to my group, which was not great because my advisor ended up leaving Berkeley after 17 years at Berkeley, which happened unexpectedly. So then that didn't work out. And then he finally found another advisor and graduated with that advisor. And it really didn't take him that much longer than it took me to finish my PhD. Even with all of that happening, it didn't take him that much longer. And so I think I think about the conversations I've had with him, and he just felt like he should have just switched earlier. Like he just shouldn't have waited so long from that first group that he felt like wasn't a good fit. So, all the examples I think of where people switch, they just were afraid to switch. And it wasn't really that they didn't know if they wanted to switch or not. They kind of knew. They were just afraid to do it. And I think the most important thing, especially in your first year, is to just realize that it's still a flexible year. I stayed in the same group, but everything I did my first year was trash. Like I didn't use any of it. I never published anything. Didn't go my thesis. I mean, it was just garbage. Like I didn't do anything with it. And so if someone had told me, hey, your first year, everything you do in your first year is not going to go anywhere. No one's going to see it. No one's going to care. Maybe I would have spent more time thinking about my, advisors and what kind of situation I wanted to be in. So the first year I think is like really, really flexible, a lot more flexible than people think. You should never feel like you're stuck because of the decision you made because you were a senior in undergrad and didn't have enough time to think about what the heck you're going to do if you started grad school. It's just not enough time sometimes. So I would really utilize that first year to give yourself the space and the bandwidth to figure out what works for you and just switch groups if it's not working.
So just to show how universal this is, I know, a dozen or 24 people that have switched and not a single one of them regrets it. And I know some people who haven't switched and they regretted it. And I'm wondering if everyone else here has the same statistics.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah? Sam?
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
So, and no one has ever switched and then been, I don't know what the word would be, like looked down upon for having switched, right? No one's ever been like, had lost credit or something.
Nobody cares.
Switched. No one cares that they switched.
No one even knows that it happened
Literally
after it happens.
nobody notices, right?
Yeah.
It's like we think it's a big deal. It's like, oh, if I switch labs, which like I never considered, but because part of that is because my undergrad advisor was literally the polar opposite of Andrea. So like I came into grad school being like, I want the other end of the spectrum, and people who know my undergrad advisor was like, wow, you found it, yeah. But like. You have in your head, everyone's going to judge me. Everyone's going to think, wow, you made this big mistake the first time. How could, nobody even notices.
Yeah, no one cares.
Like, yeah, I feel like the people who switch labs talk about it more and like obsessed over it more. And everyone else is like, wait, you switched? I didn't even know.
Like most things in life.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, the only losers in this, even the profs aren't losers, right? Because the profs understand that it's a topic. It could be like a topic issue. The only time it looks bad on a professor is if multiple students switch out of a professor's lab, and then people start noticing. But if it's like, one person every other year leaving the lab for whatever reason, that's totally fine. That's part of the process.
But also, if you're a part of a swarm of students leaving, that's not your problem. That's their problem.
Yes,
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. So kind of switching topics a little bit, since the next panel is talking about, careers outside of academia, and, I have a nice panel here where Sam is doing policy, Orad is doing a postdoc and applying for faculty positions, and Nishita started a company, so it's, a nice compare-contrast. I'd kind of like to spend the last 10 minutes or so talking about why, right? So...
Can I go first?
You can go first. Why have you decided to stay in this path?
There are almost no reasons to do a postdoc. Right? There are reasons, but there are almost no reasons. Okay? So I will list the reasons, and then I can bow out from this conversation. Okay? Mm-hmm. The first reason to do a postdoc is because you got an opportunity to work with somebody very special, and you can only do it if you stay in academia. So such and such invented this, and I just want to be in their presence for the next 2 years. I don't care if I stay in academia or in industry after. I just want to work with so-and-so. That's one reason to do a postdoc. Second reason to do a postdoc is because you really want to stay in academia. You want to become a professor. You want to have students. You want to run a lab of some kind. That's the second reason. And then the third reason is, obviously, okay, excluding I want to be in this place because it's close to my family, things like that. I mean, in terms of professional development reasons. The third professional development reason is you're a pro at one particular topic, and you really want to learn a second particular topic because you want to put them together for whatever reason. Because you want to start a company on that topic, because you want to become a professor, or because you want to move into that industry. And a postdoc is one way to do that. And that's it. Those are the three reasons to do a postdoc. You do not do a postdoc just to kind of stay on the academia train because, it's a way to get paid and keep doing research. Just go into industry and do research there. There's no sense in getting paid exactly half or a third of what other people are making in a job that has an expiration date where you really start to overstay your welcome. And also where you're when I was hired for my postdoc, my current boss said to me, my job, so this is him speaking, my job is to serve all of my students. And your job is to serve me, right? So a postdoc really is like the right-hand man of a professor. They have to work on writing grants. They have to do all sorts of stuff. They're kind of a doormat. They're at the bottom of the totem pole. They're not there to get credit. They're not there. They're just there to kind of further their own experience in a way that is only intrinsically rewarding and not rewarding in any other way, such as financially or in terms of credit or anything else. So there are many, many reasons not to do a postdoc, and only 3 reasons to do a postdoc. That's my spiel. It's just everyone thinks they're going to be professors, and not everyone knows what that actually means. So that's why I have to come up with and say it. Andrea, is that right? Would you say? As someone who trains postdocs?
I think every faculty member treats their postdocs differently. I'm
treated extremely well. Can I just say? I love my job. I would do it forever if that was an option, but postdocs are temporary positions. So.
Yeah, they are temporary positions, and I think the only reason someone should do one is if you want to be a faculty member. I think that's it. I don't think there's any other reasons to do one.
You don't think my first 2 reasons are any good? Or my first and third reason are any good? Do you get to work with somebody specific? You don't think that's a good reason?
If you don't, I think why would you want to just go get additional training if you're then planning on bouncing to industry? I think you should go bounce to industry.
If you can work with the person who invented such and such topic, and you can probably glean some insight from them that you can't from anyone else.
That means you probably should be an academic to begin with.
Well, then at least I'm self-consistent.
Yes, you're self-consistent. So that's good. So, Nishita, you're up next.
Okay, sorry. What was the question? Why am I doing what I'm doing?
Why are you doing what you're doing? How
did it happen?
Yeah, how did it happen?
Yeah.
Did getting a PhD help you make it happen?
So how did it happen? So, as we all know now, my primary advisor is very hands-off, doesn't respond to a lot of things, left Berkeley during my 4th year. The advantage to that is, I got to do whatever I wanted on research, but I also got to do whatever I wanted in general. He really didn't know what I was doing most of the time. And one of the things that I'd worked on as part of my research that ended up not even going into my thesis, but it was like a small side project I was working on with another grad student who's a friend of mine. We actually ended up spinning that out into a company. So it was in my 5th year of grad school that we started the company, and I didn't even tell my advisor until like a month or two later. He didn't even know. He also didn't really care. And I think in a lot of ways, getting the PhD and even working with him specifically actually led into that really well, because I just got to a point where I was just making decisions I needed to make for myself, and without really considering whether he would be okay with it or not. Because at that point it was like, okay, this is my life. This is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm interested in. So I just started making those decisions. And I just, did whatever I thought was best for me. And so in a lot of ways, I think the training that I actually got from him, like learning how to be so independent in my PhD, has really helped a lot in what I'm doing now. And so even now running the startup, there's a lot of overlap in skill sets and what you're, being able to do things independently, being self-motivated, working with a lot of moving parts and trying to figure out how things fit together, trying to figure out what to work on, what's the most important thing to work on when you have tons and tons of experiments. Some of them are going to be more important, more valuable than others, in the same way like with the startup. I have a ton of things to work on, but some things are going to be more important than others. And so I think, and Sam and Orad also mentioned this, it's like it's the skills you learn in your PhD that are the most valuable ultimately. And even if you stay in academia, you're most likely not going to stay in the exact same research topic. Very few people do that. So the skills that I learned in my PhD, the skills that I learned in my PhD have definitely been really useful for me in my career currently. But yeah, that's how it all happened. And it was all very fluid, the way it all happened. It felt very natural, like a very natural progression.
Nishita, you mentioned a bunch of soft skills. I don't know your startup or your research, so is your startup topic at all related to your thesis topic?
It is not related to my thesis topic, but it's in the same area, the same type of field. So it involves like a lot of nanofab devices, solid state physics. So it's the same area of expertise. But just in terms of so I actually do more of the business end of things, and my co-founder does more of the technical stuff now. So I've actually totally switched over to doing all business. But I would say even the things I learned in my PhD, being with my advisor who is so hands-off, are super useful now. I don't really care if I send emails and people don't respond. I'll just keep sending emails anyway. It doesn't really bother me. So little things like that I think really help. And you guys have both you and Sam have said a PhD it's a difficult thing to do, and it takes a long time, and it's not an easy path. And there are a lot of reasons why you shouldn't do it. And all the things you learn while you're doing your PhD and discovering things and discovering your own skill sets will ultimately help you in whatever it is you choose to do later on. As long as you don't look at it as I'm trying to get the degree and get out really fast. And then you may not learn those skills because it takes time to develop those skills.
So batter up. I work in policy now, which is real different. But that being said, I will start by saying the PhD made it happen. Rand Corporation, for those of you who don't know, pretty much only hires PhDs to do research. PhDs from every walk of life, but PhDs nonetheless. So that was critical for me getting my position now. But really, I think there were a couple turning points for me, and I was one of those people, I only applied to work at Rand after grad school, or towards the end of grad school. That was it. And I kind of put all my eggs in one basket. And it's funny because my husband, who is the person I was engaged to when I met Andrea, same person. So didn't switch advisors or fiancés, which is correct. So he applied to dozens of jobs when he was in a similar position after school. And I did not. So I kind of knew I wanted to work at Rand. And I think for me, so I did a lot of work designing, building, validating, testing a malaria diagnostic the last few years of grad school. And so that means I was exposed to just malaria and a lot of issues that are pervasive in sub-Saharan Africa. And for me, that's always been a really big driver, is kind of wanting to close the gap between the haves and the have-nots. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit in a lot of areas of the world where it's like malaria used to be a problem in the U.S. in the 1920s. It's not anymore, mostly because we have money. Yet it's still the number one killer in most parts of Africa. That seems like a huge discrepancy to me that should be fixed. So that's kind of part of what prompted me to want to do this diagnostic work in the first place. But ultimately what led me to wanting to do more policy work there were like 2 points. One was when this malaria diagnostic got a lot of attention in the malaria community about maybe like a year and a half into me starting this work. Basically, it was pitched as like, it's cheap, it's highly portable, it's essentially a pulse ox that you can pop on the end of your finger, and using laser and magnets, copycats, we'll be able to detect malaria in like a minute. I was like, well, that sucks, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do. So, but nobody read the fine print, nobody read the technical papers, and if you did, you realized that the key limitation that they talked about, like 2 sentences at the very, very end of the paper that nobody ever reads because nobody cares, was that, oh, by the way, our diagnostic doesn't work if you have dark skin pigmentation. For those of you who don't know, that's the vast majority of people affected by malaria. So this, I honestly felt so horrified by this and completely disillusioned that I was like, this is wrong. This is downright wrong that this is allowed at all. And then in a lot of the malaria diagnostic work I was doing, I also realized that there, because being scientists and engineers working in a lab, it's like, okay, I'm going to focus on this problem, a diagnostic. I know that there are effective anti-malarials out there. So fortunately, if I get a diagnostic right, then the treatment's covered, which is a great place to be. But I realized the last year and a half or so that there is a huge market for counterfeit anti-malarials in sub-Saharan Africa. It's huge, which makes sense. I mean, anti-malarials are pretty much a thing that it's a matter of when you need them, not if you need them. And that felt like a really big problem for me. And that actually in and of itself was ultimately what made me decide I wanted to do more policy work. I wanted to be more on that back end. And I also feel like, and I'll make this quick, there's a big disconnect between technology in the lab and technology actually being deployed in real life. And there aren't many people that work at that connection. And that is another big emphasis of a lot of the work that I do at RAND, is trying to actually bridge that gap between really great, awesome research being done in more academic university settings, and then actually making sure it makes it outside the lab, because so much of it doesn't. And a lot of that is due to policy issues. So yeah, that's I could go on for hours, but that's kind of in a nutshell how I ended up where I am.
So I'm going to ask one very, very last question, because we have a break after this, so I'm going to take advantage of the fact that we have a break after this and go over a little bit. So the question was asked...
You're the boss, man. Do whatever you want to do.
You're the boss.
Well, I mean, I understand if you have to go.
The break.
Yeah, I understand if you have to go. Okay, so the last question is... what if a student lab bounced because they were unable to find a lab that suited their interests or had an incompatible culture? How should they handle that topic in their applications? Right. So this is an undergraduate that bounced between a lot of labs, and then they're writing their personal statement. How do they discuss that in their application? Right. So, Nishita, you don't get to answer this because you didn't lab bounce.
I have a question, though. Is that really something that's looked down upon as an undergrad?
So I would say it can be, it depends on how it is addressed, right? Sam lab bounced extensively. Yeah.
I did. I school bounced. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was going to let her answer this one. I do not know if Orad lab bounced, although he not only he took a year break.
I did
Right,
take a year break. Yeah.
Right, so that's something else that would need to be addressed in an application personal statement.
Right.
So how did both of you handle either lab bouncing or taking a year off and a year break? And also, yeah, so I'll let Orad go first.
Oh, okay, I'll go first.
Yeah.
So
how did you do that?
So in terms of my lab experiences, so I did start by saying I did a PhD in theoretical physics because I thought I was going to be a theorist. And then I did my first theory physics research project, and I absolutely hated it. And I had kind of like a crisis of faith where I was like, oh my God, I was going to be Richard Feynman and now I'm going to be nobody. And like, I hate what I thought I loved. And how could I hate this? I used to love this. And I realized that I didn't realize, I just didn't know what it was. And then I took this kind of lab course that was mandatory, and I was like, lab course, why would I do this? And I loved it like so much. I adored it. And then I was desperately looking for a lab research experience. So, and so also just to echo what Nishita said, which was I didn't know lab bouncing was a bad thing, right? Because you're looking for what you like. So that's what I wrote in my letter, which was I didn't know what I liked. I thought I was going to be a theorist. Turns out I wasn't a theorist. Like, not that I'm capable, but like I find it tremendously boring, and I didn't find the rewards to feel rewarding.
I'm going to interrupt you. Perhaps don't say that you found it boring if you're writing your statement. Always stay positive when writing a statement. Okay, please continue.
Sorry. So anyhow, so that's what I said. Is I did something and I realized it wasn't for me, and then I did something else and I realized it was for me, and yeah. And then the year break. So the year break was because in about October, November, when everybody was writing applications and was doing their GRE, I was really burnt out, and I didn't feel capable of writing applications, and I also didn't know if I wanted to do a PhD or a master's. I mean, everyone was just kind of on this, I call it like the train, right? You just next stop, master's degree, and everyone was doing that, and I didn't know if that's what I wanted. And I took time off, which really upset my parents, actually, oddly, because anyway, it doesn't matter why. So I took time off, and well, I'm the first of a set of 5 brothers to go into college. I'm the youngest, and I'm the first to go into college. So, and I was going to do a master's. It seemed so clear, and then I don't want to go to master's. I'm like, what? Yeah. So they're surprised by this, but that doesn't matter. So I took a year off. And in that year, I spent part of it kind of working in the lab where I did my undergrad research project, but I was there for free just to kind of hang out. And eventually they did find some way to pay me, so I would recommend working for free. There's always a way to find money, but and then I backpacked in Europe for 9 months. Okay, so that's what I did in my year off. And in between that, I met with literally every professor in the physics department and half of the professors in the electrical engineering department. Literally all of them. I had a one-on-one meeting with literally every professor, asking them what they did, why they liked it, even the theorists, what they did, why they liked it, what their day-to-day was like, what my day-to-day would be like if I did what they did, what it was like working in their lab, knowing that I probably wasn't going to do my master's in the same department, just to get a sense. So I spoke to every person to see what was out there. And that was the first time I saw somebody holding graphene. Someone was like, hey, this is graphene. And I looked at it and I was like, that's not very impressive. And then, anyway, it doesn't matter. Graphene is actually a very interesting material, but that's neither here nor there. But that was when I first hit on the idea of photonics and optical computing, and that's when I ended up putting my letter. And the only reason I even knew about this was because I spoke to everyone. And everyone I spoke to, I asked them to recommend me someone else to speak to, and I did that train. And so in my letter, I was able to say this. I was in this lab. I didn't like that. I was in this other lab. I much liked that, but it still wasn't for me. I spoke to them and literally everyone else in my department to see what topics suited me best. And this was the topic I picked. So I don't think it's a bad thing to switch labs. I'm surprised to hear that someone's worried about it.
I think it's a common concern.
I'm surprised to hear that, yeah. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah, so I switched schools and I switched a lot of labs. So I started at Caltech. I wanted to be a bioengineer. They didn't have that. They were in the process of developing the bioengineering department when I was there. So they were like, why don't you be a chemical engineer? It's close enough, right? No, it's not. It's really far off. So I hated it. I also hated, I'll use the word hate. I hated Caltech for a lot of reasons. Sidebar, if anyone's ever interested in talking about that, Andrea and I have a lot of feelings about this topic. So I left, I went to Berkeley. and I decided to be a biomedical engineer there because being a chemical engineer at Caltech only made me realize that I really wanted to be a bioengineer and be somewhere else. So I switched schools, which obviously isn't a huge deal. But then when I was at Berkeley, it was a little bit of that kid in a candy shop mentality. Caltech is very single-faceted, as I'm sure many of you know. And there isn't a lot of breadth at the school, especially for undergrads. And so once I got to Berkeley, I was just like, I love everything. I love Berkeley. I love being back in Northern California. Like, everything was just, like, euphoric. So then I was just sprinting like a madman around the campus, like being in all these different student groups. I was in, like, this pro bono consulting group that part of the business school. I don't know what I was doing there. I was in the triathlon club. I was doing all these things. And then I was in all these different labs. And so part of it was very much like coming from Caltech to Berkeley was a huge switch. And I felt very gypped that I only got 2 years at Berkeley and not a full 4. And so I felt like I had to cram 4 years of experience into 2, which was not very easy to do. Part of it, too, was me trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. And each of the labs that I did work in was distinctly different from each other. Part of it was because with bioengineering, at Berkeley, and I'm sure at a lot of schools too, you can choose what track you want. Medical devices was the track that I chose, but you could choose any of 4 or 5 different tracks. And so while I chose medical devices, I didn't know for sure if that was what I wanted to do. So basically, the labs that I worked in were different tracks that you could have chosen within bioengineering. So there was one lab that I worked in that was primarily human-machine interface type work. That's a huge part of bioengineering, and something that I kind of wanted to figure out. So I did do a lot of lab hopping, and I remember because Andrea knew I wanted to work in her lab, and I don't remember when this phone call was. We had a few phone calls like during the application process, and she called me at one point. I was in my then fiance's apartment. We're just like hanging out. I get a call from Andrea. I'm like, oh shit. And she's like, so, walking through the admissions process. She's like, I know you're interested in USC. You did a lot at Berkeley. She's like, you did a lot of things. Like, can you kind of explain this? And so I did. I explained it pretty candidly, and I said that I felt like having got all of that out of my system, I finally felt very content settling down into one topic. And so I was like, honestly, now that I've tried out all these different things, I feel more ready than ever to settle. And she was like, okay. She didn't really give me like a lot of feedback on my answer. So, I mean, obviously it wasn't like the worst answer, but she was like, okay, got it. Like, thank you for being honest. Just kind of wanted to clarify like why you were doing so many things in such a short period of time. So I think it just goes back to do it for a reason. I mean, if you're just kind of running around doing all these things with no real point, that's completely different. But if you're doing it kind of with the intent of trying to figure out what you want to do, I think that helps a lot. And if then you prove, like, once you get to grad school, like, just do one thing now. Like, that's what grad school's for, focus. And that obviously helps too. So, but yeah, I wouldn't be concerned about it. I would just have a reason for it, be able to explain it well.
Yeah, I think if you have that situation and you're trying to frame it in an essay, then I would just focus more on like why you did it and what you learned from it and the skills you took away from it and what you learned about yourself or what your interests are, and not focus. I think sometimes people make the mistake of focusing, like I'm thinking back to application essays that I've read. I think people can sometimes make the mistake of focusing on the negatives and like trying to, defend themselves almost and try to not make themselves look bad. It's like, don't worry about all that. Just focus on what are the takeaways, what are the positives, what did you learn from it, and how you moved on from it. And that's all that really matters.
Exactly. And like, for example, in Sam's case, like I called her to like ask her like what exactly she was planning on focusing on in the future, and like that answer could have been in her personal statement. Like I did all of these things because I was trying to figure out this thing about myself, right? And instead her essay was like, here, I did all of these things. And like that last like sentence kind of wasn't there. So it's fine. I followed up. I just asked, cause will just follow up and ask. But if you couch it in a, like I was motivated to do all of these things because I wanted, like I was on a self journey, exactly like the previous panelist said, like your personal statement should be your self journey story. Then, the richer that journey is, the better, right? So you just have to, explain. And I'm sure Nishita also sees this, right, in your applicants.
Yep.
You need to paint a picture.
Yeah, I mean, you can spin a lot of things any way you want to. You just have to choose to spin it. And I mean, a lot of what I do now.
Yeah.
So I didn't really speak about admission process because I was the last panel, but that reminds me, basically, if everything you're doing is the truth about who you are, right? So if the truth is you didn't know what you wanted, then the truth is you tried this and you didn't like it, and then the truth is that you found something else and you did like it, the people reading your application, I mean, they assume you're telling the truth, and then they know what's a better fit for them. So you might be rejected from, like, you might not be accepted into all of the places. I was not accepted to most of the places I applied to. But you only go to one, and the one that will accept you will be the one that matches your truth. So if your truth is, yeah, I realized I don't want to be a theorist, and I thought I did, and actually I really want to be a hands-on experimentalist. Well, I didn't get accepted into the theorist programs, but I did get accepted into an experimentalist program. And specifically one that was working on the topic that I had said that I wanted my letter. So as long as what you're saying is the truth, it won't maximize all the numbers of schools you'll get into, but it'll maximize the places you get into that are a good fit for you. And you only go to one anyway. It's your something. In which case you go to two.
Okay, so I think we're going to stop there so at least we get a 5-minute break before the next panel. So I'm glad I put in a break. Okay, so I want to thank our panelists, and thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great afternoon or evening.